So yesterday, I spent some time trying to get ahead of this, seeking direction for the times that we find ourselves in, and trying to utilize these peculiar intersecting of events, connecting so many different influences, and just trying to use this opportunity to align some things. And so today I spent a little bit of time praying about it and then thinking, all right, so there's some things here and help us to kind of benefit from at least a corrective outcome, at least a merging of, our communities and our spirit and healing and some of these other intertwined confusions and things that are seeming to kind of allow for others to invest, in proper divisiveness and destruction into our communities and into these networks of, for attempts of reconciliatory type approaches, whether it be through our nation and geopolitical, global connections and whatnot. So anyway, spending some time thinking about that, I had started to ponder or think about approaching some of the, so I had in mind that I eventually would reapproach some of the debate material placed out as an offering from Sam Harris. And I had this whole long story about years past. I had entered into this writing competition. And he had summarized some of his, it did seem like somewhat of an offering. And I had entered into that writing competition. And around that time, I was living in Oregon, and I just had all these forces come against me. It was such a strange occurrence. And in the midst of it, I had all these other connections being made and others that would come into my life and try to help me. And then I was down there in this kind of what seemed to be a rare ice storm, came through the town and put weight on the power lines and the trees, and the power went out. And I just, I remember that as this strange battle, right? This tree broke open in front of this place where I was staying, and I just thought, okay, there's some strange things going on with this, right? This whole intersecting of events and me being kind of placed in this whole thing. And so I remember at that time I had to get to a point where I reached out to someone, and what was peculiar about it was on the other side of things, because I remember getting to the point where I was sitting in there, I was trying to juggle things, and I was trying to reach the deadline for this writing competition, this debate material, right? And Sam Harris was actually offering it as though, if I have someone change my mind with this material, then I'll, basically concede or, whatever. Events had built up to all of that stuff. And so I was trying to I had felt like life had brought me into these very situations. And so I was just feeling like that was what I was supposed to do. And so in the midst of trying it, all of these battles just started to break out around me. Just this strange events. And so I remember sitting there, the power was out. It was dark, and I had young ones at the time, and I was kind of juggling some things. And I remember just thinking, looking at all of these notes that I had on the bed, and I needed to get my kids something to eat and just a variety of things. And I just remember thinking, what's going on? Because at the same time, I also had some people making these calls and having me, go finish these other projects and do some other things. And it was just all these things around me, right? These forces and stuff. And so I remember sitting there and I was thinking, God, I don't know what to do at this point. That I'm not trying to resist this. I'm not in denial. I'm trying to do what it seems like life has brought me into, like focus on and to be a part of, and all these things are just kind of breaking against me, and strange occurrences and numerous obstacles. And so if it, like if I'm to do this, then just help me do this, help me understand what I need to do or see, because you have to be the one to kind of, bring me through this and what have you. And so then eventually I kind of had this stirring in my heart, like, what have I not tried, And so then, and I'd shared this story before, but it kind of goes with this, and I don't, I've gone through so many different scenarios of trying to explain that I don't know where people are at. And so I'm just trying to reiterate some of this story, not trying to go into all the details of this, because there's this other subject that I'm trying to get to that's surfacing that I feel like I need to spend some time thinking about. So I kind of have this surfacing in my mind, this like these ideas kind of surfacing in my heart and mind, and it's something to the effect of like, can you articulate or explain what your needs are if someone were to meet them or want to meet those needs? Something to that effect. Something about just kind of like taking the swarm of ideas all over the place and like, what would you ask? What do you need? Say what you need. And so I remember sitting there and thinking, because, I tend to kind of be somebody that I'll do it, I'll do it myself. I'll take the brunt of it. I'll do this, that, the other. And so I remember sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, what do I need? What do I need? And I was like, for one, I need the electricity to be back on so I can finish this, because that's the mode by which I'm like requested to participate, like on par with this request, right? So the electricity, I need to go somewhere where the electricity is back on. Like if I had a magic wand or somebody to ask for help, I need someone to help take care of my young kids at the time, because they're young and busy, and they, we need to get some dinner going because the power's out and we just didn't have any, like it was just our situation at the time. And I need somewhere to quietly study, and I could do the rest. I could finish it. And so I remember this kind of peace coming over me of like, I finally articulated the basic things that I needed for what I was like facing at the time. And so then this kind of like idea comes over me of like, ask this person, call someone. And so I remember sitting there, and this person that I had just kind of met and had been visiting with and had shown like major support for this project that I was working on when I would go study at the local library, while my little one was like going to like school and preschool or whatever. And they just instantly came to mind, because like every other avenue was just kind of like not working out. And I remember thinking, okay, I kind of have to humble myself and ask someone, I was just kind of like trying to do it on my own or whatever. And so I call this person, and they pick up immediately. And I kind of explain the situation, and he's kind of heard, and he's kind of in a different part of town where the power's not out. And he's like, man, I'm so glad you called. It's an older person, so it wasn't some kind of like other situation going on. It was kind of like a mentor teacher, like older person. And he had like previously, like we met, like we actually, I forget, it was kind of a strange occurrence how we met. And then I'd always go study. He just happened to be, because like when the city library would open, people sometimes, I'd hardly ever been there so early to where it was closed and people, like crowds were waiting outside. But that day I happened to be there earlier, and so there was these crowds outside. That's when I met him. We kind of like just happened to bump into each other in this crowd. It was like really a timing thing, right? I had all these, like, I had this bag of books, and he's like, oh, what are you studying, and then, because we were like waiting. And I just said, oh, just kind of doing this essay thing, whatever. And he's like, oh, what is it, Anyway, so then it happened that it was kind of the field of study that he was in. he was like super excited about the content because it was just kind of intersected with stuff that he'd worked on in the past. And so he was really interested. He ended up buying me like some books and some other stuff, and then he just kept having this interest about it. And he'd actually just happened to be in town for a brief time helping his brother because his brother was gone or whatever. Anyway, so it was this whole series of things. I call him and just, kind of see what's going on or whatever. Anyway, long story short, he had said he just could not rest. Like, he was just kind of pacing or whatever, and he just was wondering how it's going, and he was just concerned, and he was like restless. And he's like, man, yeah, if there's any way I could help, I just feel like I can't even focus. I'm just I'm just like stirring or whatever. And so I'm like, well, these are kind of some of the things I need help with, and otherwise I just don't think I can meet the deadline. And so then anyway, basically he helps me with all those things. It kind of works out. We end up creating these networks and whatever. The whole pressure, being kind of in that crucible and the pressure of all of these intersecting things, I was able to kind of formulate some ideas and refine some notes based on this whole essay contest that was being offered. We're kind of like in this whole battle or whatever, and it gets down to the last thing, and I end up like not meeting the deadline, long story short. And so I just remember thinking, why does this keep happening? Like, the story just keeps being prolonged, and then each situation kind of like is this crucible for this one portion, and this other portion. But then it doesn't quite become the thing. It's like we just make it over the, it's like we just like land right over the line, and then the goals shift and it's the next thing. And I'm just like, man. So I'm thinking about this, right? And I think, it's not just like we were sitting there thinking like, man, we didn't make it. And it was like a battle though. But it was networking people. And I remember thinking like, I'm going to put that away. Like, I knew there was a whole thing going on, and I kept those notes, and I still have those notes, and I look at them from time to time. And then over the years, I would think, all right, it's kind of time for the next thing. And I would always kind of think about it, and I would imagine, when is it time to go back to that? When do I go back to this whole scenario? And I started to realize it really got my attention. Something's going on here, And I was formulating this argument. There was this bigger battle that was networking and connecting. And anyway, so I had those notes for years. It was a section of my life where I read and studied a lot. I probably would have been, even though I battled Sam Harris, I was probably a little bit of like I don't know that I want to like give him this much credit, because I oppose some of his stuff still. But it was a little bit of like maybe the Plato to the Socrates. I don't know if that's the right kind of reference, because there's some tension there. But basically, in my formulating my argument in opposition to his, there was some kind of something happening there. And, our minds were kind of being changed and other things were happening. He was kind of developing some levels of nuance and whatnot, but there was still just kind of this pending other stuff. So anyway, long story short, like, my life kind of shifts, and I start doing some other things, and I still have this kind of like bookmarked, right? I have these notes, I have this stuff that was developed from that time. I had thoroughly researched it. I'd spent hours with it. I had notes and page numbers and all this stuff. And then I had to like kind of deconstruct some of the argument into these like this small 1,000 words, right? So it was useful, like the whole thing, it was useful. But yeah, I'm thinking about that. I better speed forward. I have another, a lot of ground to cover. I don't want to do another near 5-hour thing. So I'd noticed, and he had seemed to notice, and others following, that there was a weird energy attached to whatever was happening, a merging of things, right? Then life would so I'd start to notice these things where life would kind of situate me in certain experiences, and then it'd shift, and it'd kind of be like, okay, hold this, bookmark this, and then now go into this life lesson and bookmark this, and kind of just developing these points of understanding, right? And so from time to time over years, I would then, I'm trying to think, like, when was that actually? Was it like 2013? I don't know, but time would pass, and from time to time I would think, is it time to revisit this? This is like unfinished business, and I'd look over the notes and I'd put them back in the little file and I'd put them away. And then I just feel like, life had these other stages of things for me to like go through and whatnot. Trying to, like kind of, there's a lot of things to untangle here. Anyway, where was I even getting with this story? So I'm kind of thinking about that. I'm thinking about all these different situations, and now I feel like strangely I'm returning to this whole Sam Harris thing and these discussions and religion simply because it's a useful reference point to summarize all this other activity and stuff that had gone on over all these years. I missed a lot of other portions of the story, as I was thinking about it. I'm like, oh, I forgot this part and that part, but we have the general idea, the general reference point of things. So I guess my point though was I was imagining, among other things, I might get to the point where I revisit some of those ideas that he kind of outlined, and just see where I'm at this point, revisit it and see where I'm at. And but something that I have to attempt, so some of the topics that had come up, though, as I'm trying to get back to looking at some of these other references, is one of the portions of his argument in the Moral Landscape Challenge is something to the effect of, at the very base, there's this kind of mystery force, right? He doesn't use these terms. He says conscious creatures, like consciousness. So he has some level where he bases the parameters of his argument on consciousness. For me, when I approach that, I say like God, or the mystery force of God, or the life force that is God. The life force, the mystery, invisibility of whatever connects us into life. He calls it consciousness. So he starts this argument at this like baseline, beyond the baseline, which is behind everything that has the animation, the consciousness, conscious creatures. So he kind of starts there. Conscious creatures. So the argument is that he, at this point, is combating religion, right? If you follow some of the debates, it develops into, eventually the claims of religion are that you can't be moral without God. And so at this time, when you're following these religion atheist debates, he starts to make these claims that that's not, he kind of combats it as like, what does that even mean? And then the religious groups would get into scripture, and then they would say basically God can do what God wants, God is supreme. And then it kind of gets into these conquest narratives and their form of trying to justify systemic development and whatnot. And so there's a lot of material out there where, various ones are arguing those points. In this area, I kind of would tend to agree with Sam Harris. So this is kind of where there's this whole nuance of interwoven ideas where I'm like, I kind of agree with Sam Harris, because that's the approach that I tend to take, is that beyond like the scripture story, to even understand it and to interpret it from, because I had often taken like the spiritual approach, I guess you would say, is the spirit of life, the spirit of God. And so we would kind of find like, okay, we don't really technically disagree there, but I just happen to call that consciousness God. That's what I call God. And so we'd, kind of comparing notes a little bit. Then his assessment is that once God creates these consciousness develops into these incrementally developed, because he kind of would take the evolutionary science approach. Once behind the existence of these conscious creatures, once it takes physical form, there's this animation of life consciousness. Once there's consciousness, so then he's basing morality comes into existence among conscious creatures, and to gauge aspects of morality depend on like the sensory perception from conscious creatures to gauge better or worse conditions of suffering or well-being. For the most part, I generally follow so far, right? And so once you kind of have the standard of a judgment on well-being based on suffering or well-being, then he says you can produce what's better or worse. You can produce conditions and situations of what's better or worse. And this is what he calls the moral landscape. So he says there's some that are maximizing better well-being, and then some that are inhibiting well-being. And so then he says there's kind of the moral landscape. There's some that are doing better and worse. And so then he creates this assessment where some situations are creating better or worse conditions. From here, then, that's where he produces his argument for justification of certain superior systems and whatnot. And along these lines, then, if you hear his discussion or his talk, then he starts making reference to outright violence and torturous conditions and relates that to, say, like the Taliban or Islam. And then makes reference to other systems that seem to be doing better, that are not as treacherous or doing these obvious harms, right? So then he kind of formulates this like better or worse situation, the moral landscape, right? So then along these assessments, then he kind of gauges, what people's arguing point would be for justifying some of these behaviors. He gets into like religiosity, where people will say, well, if scripture says something, then God has authority, and then it makes it right. So in some ways, I generally, along these lines, I agree more so with his assessment in terms of going beyond just the text, like prior to the text, that there is a type of moral assessment that you can make, based at least on the level of the animation of life, conscious creatures, and gauging well-being versus suffering, right? So as you kind of gather along those lines, I tend to agree generally to that extent. But when he starts then applying it to these other systems, and then he kind of takes that leap of, therefore, this is kind of my assessment. I'm trying to remind myself of the summary of these things. Therefore, then when we look at different systems in the world, there's better or worse systems, and then therefore we're justified in kind of like just war or preservation of life based on better or worse approaches to the betterment of life or the reduction of harm, right? So this is where I tend to have disagreements, because then he applies this to this like kind of supremacy argument, right? There could be a little bit of some portions of truth there. But at the same time, there also, in practice, seems to be functional omission of other factors developing these various responses and whatnot. And so then over the years, it would get into, because his argument then at that point would be outright violence, right? His argument at that point is the outright point of the outcome of violence, harm, and whatnot. And so, of course, we don't, it's not like we're trying to justify outright harmful conditions and whatnot, responses of harmful outcomes. It's, so it's not justifying or rationalizing those types of things. But it also then shifts to some of his approach and then what seems to kind of be the backdrop of influence that he has within some of his spiritual approaches, mindfulness, meditation practices that influence him. He then kind of goes into talking about certain practices in religion. So he starts to make this argument of, so these are obvious harms. This is obvious violent systems or structures or what have you. And so he says, as a comparison, there's these other practices and traditions where you would never get suicide bombers. You would never get these outright violent responses and whatnot. And so then he makes reference to, like Jainism or something like that, where they're so extremely nonviolent that they don't even want to step on a bug, or they're even gentle with plants, or there's just so much like nonviolence that it would never produce some of these other behaviors. And so he kind of makes these comparisons about extreme like nonviolence and then violence and whatnot. Not to say that that's what he espouses to be, but he's just giving these various comparisons. But he does seem to make reference to various ones that utilize those types of arguments, right? Around this time then, this is when like Peter Allen, Slavoj Žižek, and different ones, they're starting to like differentiate from these other kind of movements and stuff like that. And Slavoj Žižek kind of has this like resistance towards Sam Harris. There's even kind of some video. And over the years, he's kind of evolved. And so I don't know what the most recent approach is that he has, but he says something like, because at the time there's various ones that are resisting some of the militaristic approaches, this like certain supremacy approach of like the United States militarism, like the inappropriate portions of it. Not saying like just regular defense and security and stuff like that, but the propagandist like supremacy of goodness and imagery of God and all of this stuff while doing some of these other questionable things. And so Slavoj Žižek then says something like, in critiquing, because he has that philosophical mindset too, he's kind of looking at this stuff. In critiquing some of Sam Harris's stuff, they start kind of talking about the internal violence of nonviolence. And what do I mean by that? I'm just trying to paraphrase some of their stuff. So they kind of go into talking about some of these like extreme, kind of like escapist peace, like purist peace worldviews actually are not always a good practice for people balancing out or entering into the complexities of life, because those approaches can actually create internal violence. So different types of violence. Let's see, like what's an example? So for instance, like I'll kind of say stuff like how in Native culture, at least something that actually allows us to confront some of the realities of life, to actually minimize the like over time accumulation of like accumulated suffering, is that you have to enter into stages of kind of managing and entering into levels of suffering that are a part of the condition we find ourselves in. For example, that's why we look at like in terms of the stages of like hunting and gathering and stuff like that, there's this accepted aspect of the level of degrees of sacrifice built into sustenance and whatnot, where you don't make sacrifice wasteful, in terms of like just slaughtering all these animals and whatnot. Like you accept and you're confronted with the practice of certain levels of surrender and like the sacrifice of life and whatnot. And then you have that level of appreciation. And since you're kind of confronted with it, then you don't waste it, right? So it's kind of like those where I was at the time, because there was this kind of gridlock in understanding and whatnot, we're finding that some of these purist movements were actually creating a lot of escapism that didn't always situate itself in managing and like cultivating life, because it started to create, as an example, there was some that were kind of talking about, gosh, there's a lot that goes into this. I don't want to make this like a really long theory. I'm trying to get to the story. So there'll be times in the future to talk about this, but some of these movements that became purist movements, like never, never harming any kind of creature, which, this all sounds good, right? It sounds good, like you don't want to go out of your way to harm creatures, or you kind of want to walk lightly on the land and stuff like that. But in practice, then you would find these morphed militaristic systems would, at times become coupled with these very escapist, purist movements of all of this good and purity, as though they're trying to formulate a type of moral basis unto themselves, a moralistic basis, but it wasn't really transformative. So you would find sometimes with these purist food movements, never eating meat. I'm not saying that there isn't a time or a place for certain practices of maybe not eating meat, but just in general, right? When we're looking at, because we were in this battleground arguing these points of how to confront the realities of life and whatnot. And so at some level, there was this sense where, maybe it's, there is a sense of wanting to have some level of harmony and entering into, some of the natural ecosystem of nature and whatnot. But then there was also these times where you had to confront some of the levels of the degrees of sacrifice, as I was saying, or the degrees of deterioration or breakdown or decomposition, or Peter Rollins was talking about entropy and stuff like that. That it isn't there's this aspect that we have to kind of confront some of those things and not just merge with a hyper militaristic entity, and then a purist entity that you would kind of see groups get themselves into, where it wasn't a breakthrough of relational aspect, it was kind of an escapism. And you'd kind of see that happen with throughout history, the uprising of these supremacist systems, where, so this is kind of what they're trying to put words to and work through, was that at times when there's this purity versus these arguments toward or trying to combat violence and whatnot, it was kind of this discussion about how purity can create hyper-violence. So that's kind of what we're getting to. So escapist purity movements seeking for their own kind of formulation of their moral code, so that they could, kind of generate some sense of spiritual authority to then combat some other groups, would end up being these strange associations of a denialist type purist that would outsource its militaristic, the accumulated need for aspects and components of violence to combat other systems of accused violence. And so you'd find in these strange dynamics of these things, these hyper purist movements, hyper purity. So as an example, some of these these movements where you don't eat meat, and they would kind of turn into these guardians of the earth, but they also were kind of very hostile and violent towards people and development. I had been in areas where I started to experience that. So the reason I started to experience some of these is I had moved into certain places where there were certain types of that occurring. And so a lot of times what you find emerge, and maybe I'm getting too complicated here, I'm trying to formulate some of these ideas. What you find throughout history, what it seems like when some of those types of movements emerge, they're almost always at odds with religion, with God. It's usually a type of purity and type militaristic defense combating other systems. And we can kind of ponder why does that pattern keep happening? Is it usually because there's not a breakthrough in understanding the actual nuance of God in developing our progress? Is it because people then start to resist this kind of nuanced version of God that situates us in these aspects of as I was saying, nuance and whatnot. But almost every time it's a battleground for that. And so then also what you find within this is they create these systems of this purity, and they formulate these arguments against violence, against certain competing systems that they say and claim are like hyper violent. And it's not to say that there isn't violence, but we're trying to, we're like building our case for we're getting to what's going on there, right? So I'm starting to notice this. So I'm at this time where I'm situated in this experience where life is having me focus on Sam Harrison, his arguing point and whatnot. And I'm in this other experience similar to these other dynamics of kind of this mixture of tension happening, where there's kind of these purist movements that all have this common thread where they're like this collection of maybe like some historical unresolved trauma, and they're formulating a moralistic purist movement and its own type of spirituality and defense of certain forms of the system, and they all have a certain enemy that they're saying is the violent one. And so as I'm thinking about this and I'm experiencing it, and I'm experiencing other testimonies and experiences from other people that are caught up in these systems, I then start realizing, okay, this is why God's kind of situated me in this. It's a whole new territory that I'm not used to. Because I'm used to, like, in our tribal communities, we're not, like, generally we're not able to live, like, we hadn't been able, as, being occupied people and whatnot, we hadn't been able to live in, like, the heights of the dominion of the system and what have you. And so we've had to live in the realities of feeling the pain of life and the joy of life and that whole balance of stuff. And so we can't live in an escapist, purist type mentality, right? We just have to face life. And as I think about this, and I'm put into this other system where you see this like purity, these purity movements forming, hyper spiritualized and whatnot. It's this whole new experience for me, and I'm navigating it, and I'm starting to understand how, maybe God has like situated me in that. Because I know scripture and whatnot, then it starts to remind me, I'm like, okay, I'm starting to understand, that stage of why Jesus talks about, because at the time when Jesus is confronting the system, it's also at the height of some of the things going on. There's the establishment parties and different ones. And Jesus kind of makes, because there's like these other groups that have been kind of functionally occupied as well, and they're kind of resonating with Jesus, even though it's kind of difficult to keep the pace with what's going on. And, then Jesus kind of says something like the poor, or those that, basically like those occupied in the system, will understand this more so than those that haven't. And as I was thinking about that, it says it in different ways, like the poor shall inherit the kingdom of God, stuff like that. Or those like the downtrodden of the system and stuff like that. And as I was thinking about that and putting it into like the actual practice of the patterns of human behavior, and I was thinking, maybe that's because we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel, like we have to live straight from like the ground up, and we have to see the suffering. There's no way to escape it. Because what you start to find is that, so we have to confront those choices and the nuance in life, both the suffering and the good, and we're like right there in the midst of it, right? What you find, though, is that some of these escapist movements usually are at certain heights of systems, because an actual escapist purist movement can't really function with its criteria of these like moral escapist standards, because they can only really function as they live in a system where at certain stages of the system, up from the ground, kind of separate from the stages of life and whatnot, they are then able to live protected from the stages of being confronted with other effects of the system and things where you can't be in denial of other aspects of necessary life functions or whatever. And so you find that usually when there's these groups that are living in these like hyper purist mentalities, there's always a outsource violence, that does and practices violence on behalf of them. And so it's never really like a functioning moral code all the way down. It's like a strange alliance that they make where certain ones kind of generate these moral codes and basis, and they help to functionally construe the system to be in adherence to that and the propaganda attached to it. And then they outsource this militaristic other portion of things, and then that takes on these other portions of maintaining these appearances, right? And so this is kind of what you find like in the grown complexities of systems, where they try to generate these kind of moral codes among a system that only can function through the corruption or denialism or ignorance of how that system functions. There's a lot more to say there. I kind of think I'm introducing at least enough of what I'm getting at. So this is where in the battleground of stuff over the years, as people have been talking about the morality of this, then Sam Harris would even talk about, this is where we got into the language of aligning things all the way down, the challenge to align things all the way down. People were kind of battling for things, and this is where people were challenging him, different ones that had seen some of the arguments develop, to like eat a steak, or whatever. Because at the time he was among those spiritual movements that were kind of being defined as like separate from the experience all the way down the system. And he was among those kind of like these don't eat meat, don't do these other things, these moralistic, spiritualized arguments. And then what Slavoj Žižek was saying though, and I was kind of following it too, was saying like, he's like, I hate these arguments because there's some forms of like New Age Buddhism or other things, which there's other factors, like there's other beliefs and other animations and whatnot. But he was kind of saying, when you read like Sam Harris and he is connected to those types of approaches, he has these moral arguments and whatnot, but then right next to it, near it, he has these like arguments for the militaristic form of things, which also under the surface of these like purity movements, they help it to be palpable and come to terms with justifying torture and other things that are happening. And so they come up with ways to justify this as their claim for this moral code, this morality. So basically kind of saying, like other people were saying, like under the surface of these purist movements are usually hyper-violent systems outsourcing that violence. And then arguing these points of moral purity in relation to other groups and movements, right? So we were starting to find this happen, and then this is when the arguing points started to develop too across the way, and then it got into, what about deception? Like you could talk about violence, and yes, there's violence, but what about the factors that are creating death traps, influencing through deception to select for these outcomes? What about the system forces? What about other factors that are causing people to be the scapegoat of the resulted violence? And it just keeps functioning for these groups that are isolated in these systems to try to keep generating these moral claims, right? So along those lines then, Sam Harris, like everybody kind of ups the ante in the sense of like keeping up with these critiques and whatnot over the years. So then it gets into these topics of deception, lying, scheming. What about these other animations, right? And it seems like Sam Harris over the years is trying to like keep up with it as well. So one of the things that comes up with this topic is Sam Harris kind of starts taking the stance. A lot of his approach is through the feminine aspect of things. The claims that he makes against Islam start to be developed as the arguing point is for the protection of women and women's rights. There's some legitimacy there because there were areas where there were excesses and extremists, just like in all different religions. Now we kind of see in a lot of different religions, whether it be Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism. You see people abusing the guru approach, right? There's abuse, right? Just across the board, just human beings misusing various belief systems and whatnot for their own egotistical power and such. So among these, though, more of the side that Sam Harris had been on was these animations of the feminine, the feminist aspect. And a lot of his background influences seemed to be these like purist forms of spiritual practice, purity practices, but also he was like the part of arguing the point for the militaristic justification. So they kind of have this alliance going on. So as people are then approaching this and thinking, this is why it seems to have unleashed and attracted all of this, like the feminine approach to things. And not that there isn't a time and place for that. So you would start to find, though, that his arguing point, though, when he really started to like unearth, because he started to generate these, like the violence of Islam, the violence of these men, violence, and reduction of crime, and, all this stuff, which, in a lot of ways, that's what we want to do. We want to reduce crime. We don't want to live in violent communities. We don't want all like harm being done in that sense, right? But then it got into his like arguing points were then generating from a lot of these testimonies and women. So I'm not saying that some of this isn't legitimate. I'm not saying that there aren't areas where it kind of develops into like hostile conditions, and I'm not denying that some of these women coming forward hadn't suffered levels of physical abuse and violence and whatnot. But then you start finding that then he starts generating this buy-in from kind of what becomes these more moral women's movements and whatnot. You even see this now. So you see this divide that was starting to develop, and I had seen it develop years back with so like even in Iran right now, where there's these tensions, right? And there's some of the women in Canada, US, and various ones that are coming out and saying we need to overthrow the Iranian regime, and this is about like violence against women, and we need to save women. And I had seen this arguing point develop for years, and Sam Harris was a huge influencer of this as well. And so some of his approach was, like a lot of this women's rights, moral arguments, morality and violence and stuff like that. And what he was doing was also a service of defending the system in its just war theory, where he would connect with Israel and whatnot for the defense of the supreme system, the civilized system in defense of the world and, stuff like that. The battling Islam and other enemies of this system, and the preservation of these like protections of these women, right? So as I'm confronted with this, and I'm thinking, this just doesn't seem like, it sounds like all these good things. It doesn't seem transformative. When you're around some of these women in these movements, there's a lot of deception. There's a lot of like omission. There's a lot of what seems to be lying and scheming. There is some truth though. Like, I'm not denying that there, I know that other systems develop into forms of like, violence and conflict and whatnot. But then he started to seem to take this standard and kind of draw this attraction of this like feminist type vibe that only seemed to really be able to function in that through these stages of the system's influence, and create this just war and alliance with like Israel, and this arguing point for defending the freedom of the world. And he was kind of their arguing person, and I was just thinking, this just doesn't seem right. Let's kind of unearth where this violence is coming from. These arguing points, is this really like just war theory? And what about all these women now that are, like being connected to these movements and getting all of these, like, there's this strange, escapist spiritual vibe connecting to this movement, and it doesn't seem transformative, and it's kind of speaking from this like powerful system of the world. And so that's where I find myself, right? At this time, then I have all these women from the system like just coming at me, all these energies, and I'm just like, even these are examples. Like these women are not like, they're defending this system. So you'd have Pussy Riot saying this other country is violent. Then you'd have this one saying these other countries are violent. These groups are violent. All these claims from these like women movements, right? I feel, of course I feel kind of hesitant talking about this because, it just puts me in that peculiar space where I'm like, of course I'm for women's rights. This is, maybe this is a spiritual battle, like, of course I'm for the actual alignment, all the way down, like the spirit of God, the life force, and grounded in the truths of life and what a free system actually is, right? And so then we start finding people are saying, this isn't true. These are schemes. This is weaponized feminization. And you see all these attributes of the system then formulating these connections to, like, with these women and their arguments that are situated in the system and formulating these alliances. And a lot of them have these claims on, like, abuse allegations and stuff like that. And so then, you start having people coming out with these arguments and kind of saying, well, let's look at where this violence comes from. We're not trying to justify or rationalize, violence, but let's actually look at where it comes from. So then you'd start finding people seeming to get in the way of that, seeming to get in the way of really unearthing and reconciling groups. And then you'd start to find, like, why are they blocking this? I thought their whole argument was to diffuse and de-escalate and reduce crime and reduce violence. And then you find in practice they're not trying to do that, almost as though they need this escapist purist argument to produce, through all of these measures in the system, violence, and then use that violence as their ability to manufacture and generate just war theory, because they're intending to develop justification for violence. And so then you think, well, what is your standard then if you're actually trying to intentionally develop violence through kind of like this back way of hostilities and the system and these pressures and this moralizing argument and this spiritual competition of these like hostile women against actual spiritual movements. But you don't actually want to like diffuse or deconstruct or de-escalate violence. Like, you want violence because what? It gives you this justification for this system of supremacy, right? And so then it started to get into these battles of like, well, what is true then? What about due process? What about all these false claims that are being generated of everybody else that's your quote unquote enemy of the system that's like violent and all of this stuff, when it really comes down to it, like it seems to require a lot of deception and lies prior to it. A lot of deception and lies and betrayal. And even when confronted with spiritual transformative approaches, direct betrayal of that, or denial of it, or scheming and lying about it. So then it starts to generate and get into this whole other argument, right? Sam Harris even seems to be like, okay, I actually kind of see that, because, maybe he was deceived himself, or I don't know. He starts kind of budging on it, and he talks with other people. He starts to understand the ability to kind of like differentiate between these like hyper purist versus like hyper violent, and then look at what's developed in between there. And so he does kind of start seeming to consider that, and then he puts out this book about lying. So then it kind of gets into lying and false representation and, things like that. And the courage to, like, kind of tell the truth and, But there also seems ways, though, where he's trying to get ahead of the argument and there's technicalities and whatnot. But anyway, so kind of, here's where we kind of find ourselves, right? And this is why I'm saying, like, in recent events, when all these years, it had been the arguing point that they were selling to the public that Israel was this like place of democracy and non-violence in the middle of the violent Middle East and the only other option and whatnot. And then now that these stories are coming out and he's trying to keep the pace of truth, and because he kind of always seems to try to be on the precipice of truth and whatnot, I was kind of saying that in this recent, and I didn't read it, but from the sounds of it, I've heard some summaries that he's being like possibly open to critiquing or putting Israel in the same category as Islam, to his estimation. And it seems like he's maybe having, a judgment call in terms of he's not yet wanting to relinquish his like isolated, seemingly critique against Islam, but he's kind of getting ready to put Israel in that same category with these recent reports coming out. So I said, like I said, it's been this kind of battle for the ground of like what's true, right? And it seems like what various ones are trying to do is they're trying to hold back and omit information so that they can kind of be in this like justification for this battle, like misusing certain animations of like just war theory and kind of still being in denial about what's going on. And so it's still functioning in this like world dominant supremacy type system. It's not to say that it's not, like I've seen a lot of like deceptive moves taking place with a lot of different characters involved in some of these things. But so anyway, as we're thinking about this, and then this is where another part of my development over the years, my proposal was systems theory. And, some of what I was proposing was that how he, gets into the stage where he creates these separate entity systems that seem to be like in reference to different ones. I mean, there is like in reference to them, but, like comparable as these competing entities, and one is better than the other. There is some assessment that you can make along those lines, but then I started to develop this approach looking at how, for the most part, the type of violence that he's making reference to is usually within the confines of a system and in reference or response oftentimes to like occupying force, some type of dominion of an occupying force of sorts. Basically, like it doesn't happen in isolation. And then if there really was a true moral assessment, you can go into it and look at what are all the other factors that need to be assessed that are influencing the likelihood for the development of these survival type responses or enraged responses in reference to claims of, whether it be like lacking due process or needing a level of transparency, or had it even started prior to that from misinformation or direct deception. And so a lot of times you'll find that some of these like escalated situations started out from either misinformation, ignorance, or direct deception within types of influence among occupying forces. And then you'll also find that it then becomes weaponized through associations of occupying forces and systemic powers that influence these outcomes and try to moralize their argument and place it in this imagery of their competing spiritual approach or whatever the reference there might be in terms of like some propagandist justification or what have you. So then when it kind of gets to the point of arguing along these lines, his kind of counterpart was, because he was making reference to Islam and whatnot, and he was saying, it's not that they're poor. A lot of these like jihadists and various ones were doctors and lawyers and those that had a pretty comfortable life and whatnot. So those of you who followed some of these things, for one, there's also further investigation as to who was even involved in instigating various groups that they're, now stating is involved in like radical Islam. What were other factors? Like I said, it's not created in isolation. And a lot of times there's other factors with other groups and investment that are, like a part of these, like results and influencing these outcomes and whatnot. And then in some ways it would kind of turn into, people don't want to de-escalate their occupying force, that they then will concede, like they'll basically admit that at some degree there are some levels of occupying force applied on other groups, and they'll say, well, it's because we need to, there's a competing for various beliefs or ideas and stuff like that. Then that's where it kind of gets into interpretations of different factions and whatnot. So then we're looking at the system, right? They are developing these approaches. They're a part of the whole system of these outcomes of behavior, whether it be internal covert methods or deception, scheming, utilizing the system forces, channeling it through other beliefs and whatnot, or direct violence and other things. So then we kind of get to this argument of like systems, right? System forces, competing systems, and these ideas of religion and belief and whatnot. Then it gets into these competing arguments internally with the system, like we've seen it play out over the years, of like security, crime reduction, institutions, preference of institutions. And then you start to find that other groups within the system were funding other systems and institutions to select for further opportunity for some subsets of society rather than other subsets of society. And so you just start finding all these levels of influence within systems that have connections to behavioral outcomes or interpretations of success or gauging levels of supremacy or intellect. And so creating these types of arguing points within the system, right? So you can kind of follow where some of the arguing points are, right? We're getting to systems theory. We're looking at some of these things, the battle for these outcomes and understanding and whatnot. And what I was saying is then this was kind of associated with their form of systemic formulation of these like feminist movements. And, so it kind of got into this whole like toxic masculinity and the power of the feminine, but there needed also internally be this whole systemic change and transformation. And what really is spirituality? What is that proper alignment? Because we all know that there are some forms of, like the misuse of the feminine, which some of the attributes of it are a lot of deception and channeling and appearances within organizations and institutions and funding and references and, what have you. And it could, if it's, done in a harmful way or weaponized type approach, especially when it's aligned with like dominant system forces and those types of conflicts or what have you, can be really harmful. There could be real world outcomes, and a lot of people involved then are usually the outcome of not really having had the original true assessment of the situation. And so all the way down, there's just so many people that never had really had the proper information delivered to them. And most of the time when you follow it all the way back, there were people deceiving the situation, weaponizing it, and then trying to produce outcomes for their intended targeted enemies or what have you. And most of the time, those involved aren't really the ones that were generating it, aren't really the ones that were a part of it. And so, of course, there could be, over time, it can generate further and further. And especially if certain systemic forces are trying to intensify it, they can continue to fight to frame it in such ways, and then never really coming to terms with an alignment of an honest assessment, just like perpetually distorting, what's going on. And so it kind of got to that point of like, yes, there's violence and whatnot, but there's also a lot of channeling of deception aligned with like a very harmful, dominating system that seeks to frame things in such ways and is not really a corrective measure, nor the Spirit of God, or things along those lines. So over the years, then we're kind of like talking about these things, looking at the system, what really is a corrective measure. And so then, kind of switch over. I'm starting to think about this today as I'm reviewing some notes, and I'm rethinking throughout the years some of these approaches, the battleground and the system and the world, and the harm done, how destructive it is with, people put into. So here's the thing too, what generates some of this is like being within an occupied force in a system. There's already a sense where you have to battle for survival. And if the system is trying to intentionally distort and pin people against each other, it can cause people out of fear to just intensify channeling deception or deflection and whatnot. When a lot of times, there could be other simple corrective measures, better communication and whatnot. Once it gets to the point though, where it's just so entrenched and confused and entangled, it can just start causing people to get into survival mode and deflecting, and then it just becomes further entrenched, and it's difficult to get back to what's the original reset here, and also what's the outcome for a true assessment of God, because some people then can just continue in, we would never really have a breakthrough because there would be so much deflecting and collection of omission of things occurring, just so many layers, right? In the midst of people still longing for a true assessment of a spiritual breakthrough, and not just another regenerated, systemically forced appearance of connection and whatnot. It becomes difficult because a lot of people get caught up in the vulnerabilities of it and whatnot. A lot of times they say some of these behaviors can be really destructive to otherwise well-intended institutions and groups and measures, just because if there's not really that breakthrough, it just becomes another fuel of deception that could be usurped by the dominating system and packaged as another one of these improper forced conversion type approaches where you don't really feel like it's generated from the Spirit of God or that which is the attributes of God. So we get into these conundrums, right? And we get into these kind of destructive forces generating these types of approaches. And then we think, what's really transformative here? So I'm thinking about this, right? And as I was just reviewing some notes from today, this thought kind of crossed my mind. So that's what I'm going to kind of go into here. We'll kind of see where we go with it. So I had found over the years, like I said, so it's been numerous years, and I've seen a lot of groups being recruited by the system and platformed and having this moralizing argument, trying to situate it into this appearance of this feminine breakthrough in this masculine feminine. And that's all well and good. There's good things about that. Whereas I would start to ponder and I'd think, this isn't quite lined up yet, though. This isn't the breakthrough. This is another one of those, it's not really the thing. And so as I was reviewing the notes and whatnot, I was kind of thinking how, so in scripture, right, at the time when Jesus is confronted with this whole systemic growth of this, the establishment and their pressures, and his movement is growing, and the everyday people that it affects are resonating with it, and the establishment and their connection to the power system is an occupying force, and there's all these measures and things going on, and people at this point don't really seem to feel like the temple establishment in relation to the system is really the spiritual, it just doesn't, even in the story, get the feeling that it's the connection that portions of Israel were supposed to be about. So if you rewind and you think, one of the things that was a major distinction of Israel at the time was this call to work in relation to the temple and kind of stay in line to the animated path of God. And in that, they were in this like alignment with what represented God, with the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, within the center temple, their divisions in reference to the temple, the service of the temple. And this was like representing a way they commune with God, and also in keeping in step with the path of God, where God would bring them. They would be kind of in this generated path of truth, associating with their personal alignment represented to their adherence to the temple. And so as they were kind of in that dynamic in relation to wherever the world was and situating where God needed them to be, there was kind of animation of it, right? At least story-wise, we can kind of go into interpreting that later on. And even that animation, though, God, there was opportunities where, because, I also was trying to get away from like understanding how to transform from the conquest narratives, and I was suggesting that it was never God's ideal to be a part of like what develops into like the conquest portion of this like improper animation of things. There was this time where even among like whether it be the Philistines or Israel, there was this opportunity where they started to establish the animation of influence onto the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant then eventually symbolizes the like connection to God and the Holy of Holies and this like alignment with God, eventually, which like Jesus fulfills. But at the time, it's like this outward appearance of stuff where they're supposed to be in line with obedience and whatnot. And so they have this opportunity where there's this shift of this back and forth where they could actually recognize this animation and establish this connection between various groups. But they don't. They just continue to use it to generate conflict. But anyway, what we find, though, eventually, though, is as the Israelites start becoming fractured and they develop for themselves a competing powerful system, and then over time they become distracted and far from the animation of God and kind of doing their own thing and having the appearances of like, being in connection to that type of identity or spiritual calling, but not really having the animation of it. So many generations later, by the time they're like entrenched in this alliance of the temple in relation to the world power Rome at the time, that it had gone through other world powers, and so they were like long since entrenched in this relationship between the temple and the world power. It didn't seem to accompany with it that animated connection. It was kind of the appearance of the temple and these maneuvers and the world powers. And so I'm thinking about that, in relation to people kind of making reference to, like nowadays they'll make reference to Israel and talking about like this animated force and cursing and blessing if you're in the path of Israel in relation to Israel being in the path of God. But what you find is that eventually, even at the time of Jesus, there just really didn't seem to be any kind of real potency to the Spirit of God in relation to Israel, the remnant of Israel. Their power they were drawing from had started to become in relation to the world power. And so it started to seem like the responsibility that before there seemed to be this kind of animated sense of like they had to be in step with God, and they could, they could see like the trip lines of like not being in line with God. And at this time, there just didn't seem to be that much at all. There just didn't seem to be anything that kind of was carried with it. And so then you find something peculiar that Jesus in his practice was lining up was this connection to the spiritual authority, this seeming spiritual authority, and it just like accompanied him. And so it started to be that which people could see there was an influence there, even if they didn't quite understand what Jesus was doing, and it was starting to line things up. To the point where at the crucifixion, some kind of power shift aligns, and then after the crucifixion, then the this kind of animation seems to show itself, and it says that there was this great earthquake, and then the temple was split or something, or the curtain was split within the temple and whatnot. And then everyone starts realizing, oh, there's some shift going on here. There's like a return of an alignment of like some kind of spiritual authority or like something going on. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, that's kind of interesting to think about, because as I was thinking about it, there's a lot of these influencers and people that utilize a lot of like the name Christ and Jesus and whatnot. And at some level, it's just, in some ways, it just kind of doesn't really carry much influence all the time. It's not just like some magic wand that you claim or state and whatnot. I mean, to some degree, you know, there's these stirrings of things, and I'm not saying it's for nothing, but I was just thinking about this, right? And I was thinking, people kind of make these references to Jesus or Christ, and it's associated with these world powers, and it doesn't always seem as though there's like spiritual authority or transformation going on there. So I was thinking about that today. And I'm like, oh, are we at another stage where in practice, like people are drawing upon what they think is this distinction they're holding to, but it doesn't seem to have transformative value to it. And so if we're at that stage where, of course, I value like the message of Christ and the process of this, and I could see it aligning with some truths, just like universal truths and whatnot. I was thinking like, oh, it's interesting to consider that, these other groups that they just seem to have no hesitation on like the world powers of, like generating and animating themselves with this misuse of Christ and this certain power that's very anti to the actual spirit and way of Christ. There just seems to be nothing there except just them being able to continue drawing from the power of the world dominion, similar to the time of Jesus. The powers, the establishment could utilize any words, languages, likenesses, and there just seemed to be their continuous ability to simply just draw from the power actually coming just for them from the world dominion power. And I was thinking how that seems to be the case now. We have these people doing these outrageous things, right? Doing everything that's like directly opposed to, what it seems to be like the actual message and way and transformative value of the testimony of Jesus. And so I was asking myself as I considered that when I was reviewing some stuff today and thinking about this was, why is that? Why did there seem to be like not really that resonating there? Why did it seem to just like lose some of the distinction of the Christ message or the distinction of the remnant of Israel? And I was thinking about that as though, because it seems like they're not in the way of God. They weren't like in the path or the way of God in relation to the way that God is developing the kingdom and whatnot. What I also thought was peculiar, though, is that at some point, though, when does it start to lose its like spiritual authority? I mean, because they had gone from one point in the story, if we're just thinking about the story now, they had gone from one point in the story where they had the fear of God. I'm not saying you should, you should just have this like utter fear of God. There's this loving aspect and spiritual approach to it. But in terms of looking at the story, they had this caution of like not wanting to, as they were striving to be close to the work of God, which was like represented in like the temple, as I was saying, this alignment to the holy, inward most holy place. And the collective around it, as they would strive to be in that alignment, they would have this sense of reverence and a sense of fear, or a sense of like wanting to make sure they're in proper alignment. And so you think, over time, though, how does that just dissipate? Like, why did it seem to just dissipate where they weren't even drawing upon that power and that intended aligning of their lives at all? And to where it didn't even have like a resonant, it didn't seem to have too much of a resonance with like a spiritual conviction or things like that. I mean, but it did start to become this like competing against other entities for the word of it or the label of it, but not really the substance of it. And I was thinking, well, maybe because they were just getting far from it. Like, it wasn't even the desire for them to have that proper centering in their lives. They no longer really saw it as the generating methodology or power source. And they were drawing their power source in these competing systems, which was revealed as these systemic powers. And that's what we, a lot of times see now. We see like when these atheists and different ones, and they do have their good arguments and whatnot. And there's some substance to what they're talking about. But in that, some of the religious approaches to things had given up their desire to align themselves with the truth and the heart and the center and the spiritual authority of God and the methodology and the practice and the transformative value of it. And instead they like traded it out for systemic power, world dominion. It just left them vulnerable to all of these people coming in and utilizing and misusing the name and the label of it without any of the spiritual substance of it, and giving themselves over to the powers of the world. And so then I'm thinking like that's where we seem to find ourselves, and we have atheists and different ones saying, hey, it doesn't seem like there's any substance and difference between what you claim as a significant power of God and a world power system. To our calculations, everything simply just means a label that you give that's actually generated from this world power system. And it actually seems like that, right? It actually does seem like that. So when you start thinking about this, just thinking about this, like the moral landscape and stuff like that, you would think that if we're talking about consciousness and I'm claiming that God is consciousness or the animation of life, and then looking at the moral landscape and whatnot, you would think that, say, for instance, like the practice of Jesus, the Christ, like laying down his life in that sense, as he situated his life with these interactions of what it means to call into question and to pull down the occupying forces and to not utilize the occupying forces by which the consciousness of life would otherwise be able to thrive and arise from. You would think that would be more of the like moral framework of truth in the midst of this death and these confines that we find ourselves in. And then that would be the alignment of which we can connect to God, the source of life, and develop among one another. But in that, you see that people refuse to relinquish the world occupying forces and utilize it as a means by which they are trying to then portray a certain power of morality or supremacy. It seems like that's actually in opposition to like the actual, prime message of the gospel of this return to life and this spiritual freedom and this access of spiritual alignment and regenerative processes and whatnot. So anyway, like we just kind of find that a lot of that seems to become like this battleground and whatnot. And there does seem to be like this practicality of this proper alignment of things and the message of the spiritual freedom. And that tends to still be the message by which is the revelation through Scripture and prior to Scripture and in universal practice among just life and existence. And so I still tend to think that that is what we call the message and the testimony of the holiness of God, the dominion and kingdom and transformed liberation of God, and spiritual alignment and connection into the land, and freedom from these occupying forces and dominion manifestations of world power systems. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. This was a lot to kind of think over and consider. But this was kind of some of the stuff involved in these discussions with these world atheists and religion debates and whatnot. And so anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.